Let me introduce your chair of this panel, Paul Williams. Again, I think it's somebody who needs no introduction. If you didn't know, he started his career in the Office of the Legal Advisor. And then when he left and he got his PhD from Cambridge in international law, he and I co-founded, and he says I'm allowed to say that when I'm here, the Public International Law and Policy Group. And as you can see in that banner over there, which is a couple years old, it's now been around for 27 years. And Paul, I think, for a private individual, has been involved in more peace negotiations than any other individual in the history of our planet. So I think it's 36. He's been legal counsel to. So without further ado, I turn it over to Paul Williams.
Thank you, Michael. I was kind of hoping you'd play a little bit of a clip from the Terminator as well. So today we're going to be talking about, depending on your generation, we're going to be talking about robot B9 from Lost in Space. Only a few of us remember that. Or the Terminator from Skynet, or HAL from Space Odyssey, or more recently, the Cylons. So we want you to put that in your mind, because we all grew up on that as science fiction, as the future. But in a kind of scary way, the future is here. We're going to be talking about lethal, autonomous weapons. We've heard about and thought about, fire and forget weapons. You fire the weapon from your F-16 or F-22 and you forget about it. Well, now we're going to have weapons that you fire and the weapon doesn't forget. The weapon does a little thinking along the way in order to cause the most damage appropriately and proportionally and not indiscriminately in a way that meets the military objectives. But what if it doesn't work? How do we ensure that all of the rules that we've embraced for the last 75 years, or from Jim Johnson's Fireside Chat over the last 150 years, how do we ensure that we comply with these rules, the Geneva Convention rules, if we're building machines, including Michael Kelly's iPhone, apparently, that think on their own? And how do we program in the Geneva Conventions to lethal autonomous weapons? Being from Cupertino, I can say this. I'm deeply worried about what my friends from kindergarten are doing when they're coding various things, be it Facebook or Instagram and all the social ills which are attached to that. These are the same folks who are going to be coding the lethal autonomous weapons. How do we take the Geneva Conventions, from as Sandy Hodgkinson yesterday, you want an 18-year-old on the field of battle to understand what she or he can and cannot do? How do you bring that all the way through back the chain to the programmers in Silicon Valley who are building and programming these lethal autonomous weapons? So we have an amazing Thomas Jefferson panel. For those of you who were at the roundtable yesterday, the only thing to top the Nobel Peace Laureates with President Kennedy and Thomas Jefferson being a Gemini talking to himself would be this panel. I'm very excited to introduce Lori Blank, who is a criminal professor of law at Emory University. Clinical. I always write these things down. so I can get them right. Yes, it says right here. Clinical professor of law at Emory University School of Law and the director of the International Humanitarian Law Clinic. She is a renowned expert on the laws of war, and during the 2002 to 2024 time period, she served as the special counsel to the General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Defense. She has stories to tell. Her recent scholarship is focused on how legal frameworks apply to contemporary conflicts, including the use of emerging technologies in warfare, lethal autonomous weapons. I would next like to introduce Professor Craig Martin. Craig is a professor of law at Washburn University School of Law, specializing in international law, constitutional law, and the laws of war. And his recent work examines the legal implications of autonomous weapons and the application of international humanitarian law in modern conflicts. And he brings a very unique perspective on how constitutional and international norms intersect in the context of warfare. And given the central role that the ICR has played over the last 75 years and throughout the last 2 days, I'm very excited to welcome to the panel Romina Soledad Moralo. Romina is the International Committee on the Red Cross Regional Legal Advisor for the Americas, based in Bogota. Yes, we can all take a moment and be very jealous about that. She previously worked at the International Criminal Court to support the implementation of the Rome Statute in the Americas. Now, Romina's experience working at both the ICRC and the ICC places her at the forefront of discussions about humanitarian and legal implications of new military technologies, including autonomous weapons system. And finally, it's a great pleasure to introduce Milena Stereo, who needs no introduction. Okay, the first question. Oh, I should probably. Okay. All right. Well, in case you're wondering, Milena is a distinguished professor of law at Cleveland State University College of Law and the managing director of the Public International Law and Policy Group. And she is a leading voice in international law and human rights, with a particular focus on accountability in conflict zones. Now, her expertise in atrocity prevention and conflict resolution will offer some critical insights into the ethical and legal challenges posed by autonomous weapons. So let's kick it off with the first question. We're going to do Q&A, about 3 minutes for each question. We've set aside 15 minutes, which my timekeepers are just going to stand up and start clapping when we have 15 minutes left, and then we'll turn it over to you all for Q&A. So start thinking, in particular the young professionals in the room, about what questions you want to put to our Thomas Jeffersons. Lori, start us off. What is a lethal semi-autonomous weapon? What are we really talking about here?
Okay, well, first, thanks to Michael and everyone else organizing for putting on such a great conference. Very happy to be here. So autonomous weapons are weapons or weapon systems that have the capability to identify, select, and engage targets without intervention by humans in that decision-making process. Let me share a couple of definitions. So the ICRC has explained that autonomous weapons are weapons that can, basically the same thing, independently select and attack targets. That is, with autonomy in the critical functions of acquiring, tracking, selecting, and attacking targets. The U.S. Department of Defense has defined it as a weapon system that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator, right? All the same thing. This includes human-supervised autonomous weapon systems that are designed to allow human operators to override operation of the weapon system, but can select and again engage those targets without further human input after activation. So usually we think of 3 different types of autonomous weapon systems. We have what's called human in the loop or semi-autonomous systems, which requires a human to direct the system to select a target and attack it. That's what we like, or an open loop system. So an example would be the Predator, different types of UAVs. So there is a human involved there, although some of it functions again, semi-autonomously. Then we have human on the loop or human supervised autonomous systems, which select and attack targets with human operator oversight. So the Iron Dome would be an example, or the U.S. Navy's Phalanx close-in weapon system. And then there's what's called human out of the loop or fully autonomous systems that operate in a closed loop. There's no human interface. There's 2 examples we've seen in recent conflicts that I think would fit into the autonomous weapons space. So in Libya, we have reports that were then substantiated by the UN panel of experts that autonomous weapons, including loitering munitions, were, and I quote the report, programmed to attack targets without requiring data connectivity between the operator and the munition. And they described this as a true fire, forget, and find capability, although I think what they probably meant was find, fire, and forget. But Alice, I hope you're finding before you fire. That may be a question for us to discuss. I'm just sort of editing while I read the quotes here. And in Azerbaijan, there's reports of, again, use of loitering munitions that detected a target, flew into it, and destroyed it on impact with an onboard payload of explosives.
Thanks, Lori. Did anyone want to pick up on Lori's intervention and share with us what you see 4, 5, 9 to 10 years down the road? What types of weapons? What is Mike Kelly's cell phone going to create and envision all on its own? What are we looking at? Anyone can jump in.
Yes.
And then you do get the next question, Romina, about ethical and humanitarian challenges.
Then others can. Okay. No, I just wanted to mention, and it was some part as well of the other question about the concerns. We are seeing in the field different trends on how these weapons are being developed. So trends that raise these concerns, humanitarian concerns mainly, and those are that they will attack or target a wider range of targets, not only, for example, military objectives by nature. So that is a danger that we are seeing more and more, that they will be used for longer durations in wider scopes. So that's something that is also concerning in very dynamic and congested environments, something that of course, brings a lot of concerns to us, and also that there is more and more reduced human engagement with this type of weapon. So I cannot say exactly what type of weapon we're having or we will have, but there are these trends and concerning trends, at least for us as a humanitarian organization, that we're seeing on these type of weapons.
Okay. I'm going to come back to you in just a second to ask a little bit more about the humanitarian and ethical concerns. Anyone else want to jump in and make a prediction about scientific future? Melena, you don't have to raise your hand.
I'll be real brief here. I think so. I wanted to compare this for just a second to, for example, like self-driving cars, right? There's this notion, you've all seen studies. On the one hand, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so freaky, a car without a human driver. But there are all sorts of studies that show that human error actually causes most road accidents, and that self-driving cars, globally speaking, would actually cause less accidents. And so when it comes to the use of these lethal weapons, I think those who are on the side of like this is a good thing would say AI is phenomenal, and actually a human operator can cause errors and can be wrong perhaps more than a machine, right? And so I think that's an argument in favor of saying, well, AI is here to stay, these technologies are here to stay, and again, this is not such a bad thing. So that's not to predict like specific types of weapons, but it's to say that with the development of technology, we are going to have these conversations more and more and more.
So that's why I'm always very polite to ChatGPT. I always say please and thank you. So when it does start taking over targeting, it'll remember me as a friend. Craig, jump on in.
I just want to say just in 20 seconds in response to Melena's point that, one other aspect of the self-driving car phenomenon is that I think there's widespread agreement that human error causes way more accidents than AI and self-driving cars. And yet human beings are far less forgiving or tolerant of accidents that are caused by self-driving cars. Like there's just something intuitive, something instinctive in which we think that, well, if some idiot caused an accident and it caused harm, that's just human. But if a robot runs amok and kills someone, even though it's a rare occurrence, somehow that feels far worse and far more wrong. And that instinct and intuition, which I think is grounded in some ethical, unstated, unformulated ethical considerations, is very much, I think, part of the discussion on autonomous weapons.
Thanks, Craig. Romina, let's come back to you now and combine two questions. If you could expand a little bit on your humanitarian and ethical concerns about lethal autonomous weapons, and is there anything that the ICRC might be recommending or thinking about recommending in order to deal with this?
Yes, thank you very much for that. And as we just heard, the autonomous weapon system would apply force without this human intervention. So the functioning of the autonomous weapon system leads to this loss of human control and judgment over the use of force. And this brings not only humanitarian and ethical concerns, also legal, that probably we will then discuss in detail. So there is a certain level of unpredictability that, of course, we're going to have in any of these autonomous weapon systems, because the users do not know or choose specifically who is going to be the target, when the weapon is going to be activated, in which location. So these bring this humanitarian concerns of the harm of those already affected by armed conflict, also the possibility of an escalation of violence by using these type of autonomous weapons, and of course, the challenges of applying IHL. So in addition to these trends that I just mentioned that raise the concern from the humanitarian perspective, there is also the addition of artificial intelligence and in particular machine learning into these autonomous weapon systems, which might make them to be unpredictable from the design. So we have these new systems of software that will continue to learn from the different environments where they are displayed or launched in, and then they can take different decisions. So there is a process or a situation that is called the black box effect, in which even the ones that are designing these autonomous weapon system softwares or that are launching, they cannot really explain how the machine took that decision or targeted that specific person or object. So that turns the autonomous weapon system in unpredictable. From the ethical perspective, and maybe expanding a little bit of what it was said before, there is an ethical concern about taking away this human or moral agency and responsibilities that we have in life and death decisions. So leaving machines to take these decisions raise enormous ethical concerns. Most agree on that. There is no agreement on whether these ethical concerns should then ban all autonomous weapon systems, should ban autonomous weapon systems that could endanger human beings, or ban autonomous weapon systems that are used or designed to target human beings. And I think there is the room for discussion about these type of weapons. We do have recommendations, but I don't know if...
Take a couple more minutes. We'll slide some time over to you on this one.
Thank you.
They are so good. We talked about it.
Yes, exactly. I want to comply with the time. But yeah, we do have, and there are very simple recommendations. We have taken into consideration these humanitarian, ethical, and also legal concerns regarding application of IHL. We consider that it is necessary to prohibit two types of autonomous weapon systems, the ones that are inherently unpredictable, so those that we cannot really understand, predict who they are going to be attacking. Also prohibit those that are designed or used to target human beings, especially considering the principle of distinction and these ethical concerns that we mentioned before. And the third part of recommendations that we have is just taking what already some militaries are doing on making limitations regarding the direction, the geographical scope, the scale of use of autonomous weapon systems, which are the types of targets that they can have. So as I mentioned before, having objective military objectives by nature, for example, an anti-missile autonomous weapon, limit the use of these autonomous weapon systems in different situations where there is no risk for civilians, for example, and then always have or maintain certain type of human-machine intervention so the humans can, pull out and say, we're not going to do this attack if the situations have changed and then there is no any legal target involved in there.
Okay. So keeping the human in the loop, as Lori had indicated. Definitely. Okay. Now, I'm going to turn to you, Craig, for a couple of questions. When we think about lethal autonomous weapons, we all get sort of very anxious. And then Mike plays the theme song to the Terminator. We get even more anxious about what's going to happen. But this isn't the first time that new technologies have been deployed on the battlefield. And what have we done in the past? What mechanisms, what institutions have we utilized to accommodate those new technologies and ensconce them into international humanitarian law and the conventions?
Right. And if we had more time, we could go back and trace the sort of history of efforts to constrain novel weapons going all the way back to the crossbow and before. But in the modern era, the students will have heard that IHL famously regulates both the means and the methods of warfare. And what means really refers to our weapons. And there are a number of international legal regimes that date back really to the turn of the 20th century that try to regulate or do regulate specific kinds of weapons, typically weapons that are indiscriminate or cause unnecessary suffering. So if you think of the convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, right, there are a number of treaties that have been negotiated over the last 100 years that either prohibit or severely constrain the use of specific kinds of weapons. And more recently, in the 1980s, there was negotiated a convention, which a number of people have referred to already during the conference, which is the CCW. It has a much longer name, but it's the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention. And the CCW is the framework within which a number of other protocols have been negotiated to constrain or to limit the use of specific weapons like blinding laser weapons, for instance. And like last week, the protocol on the use of booby traps and other devices was very much in the news after the pager attack in Lebanon. And so those are the kinds of protocols. But we shouldn't forget that the Geneva Conventions themselves are also involved in regulating the means of warfare, in that, again, this has been referred to before in the conference. Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 requires states, and to quote, to determine whether the employment of the weapon that is being developed, acquired, or adopted by the state would, in some or all circumstances, be prohibited by IHL. In other words, states have an obligation to ensure that a weapon that they're developing or acquiring will conform and comply with the principles of IHL. And then the methods of warfare, of course, refers to how these weapons are used, and we're going to spend a lot of time, I assume, over the course of the panel talking about how IHL can, or whether it can sufficiently regulate autonomous weapon systems, or to put it a different way, whether autonomous weapon systems would conform with and comply with IHL.
Well, Greg, let me follow up on that with a second question of what has the international community done so far to regulate autonomous weapons? These aren't a thing of the future. As Lori pointed out, they're on the battlefield and being used. What are we doing to regulate this?
Yeah, so I think the central focus really is the CCW, which in 2016 turned its attention to the issue of autonomous weapon systems. And this was largely in response to a call by civil society, led very much by Human Rights Watch, which started a movement to ban killer robots, as they called it. And in 2017, the CCW established what was called a Group of Governmental Experts, or a GGE, to really take up the question of autonomous weapon systems and develop potentially a new treaty or a protocol under the CCW that would regulate autonomous weapon systems. And the GGE has met almost every year since that time. There have been many meetings, and many significant disagreements materialized immediately, including over such basic things as what an autonomous weapon system is, or how one should define autonomous weapon system, and including whether autonomous weapon systems could comply with IHL, or whether IHL was sufficient to govern autonomous weapon system, and therefore no further action was needed, on how one should understand the human-machine interface, and therefore when human control should be required in the context of IHL compliance. And I should say that there was fairly wide agreement among the states parties to the CCW that there should be humans in the loop at some point, but not necessarily agreement on when in the life cycle of the weapon system the human needed to be in the loop, and that when there had to be human interaction. And so even there were disagreements on what was meant by human control and at what stage of the human's life cycle, or the weapon's life cycle, it should be employed. And more fundamentally, there have been disagreements about whether we should only care about the effects or outcomes of a weapon's use, that is, if it complied with IHL in an objective sense, or whether the actual process of decision-making in compliance with IHL required human judgment, right? If we should care about that. And there is disagreement among the states parties over those issues. And so the basic answer to your question is the GGE last met 3 weeks ago, and there's still really no agreement. And so I think the short answer on the sort of means of warfare and whether the CCW can be relied upon to adequately deal with autonomous weapon systems is they're not really that close. And I think this is precisely why the ICRC and other organizations are saying, look, we can't rely on the CCW to develop a sort of a disarmament type limitation or prohibition or regulation of autonomous weapon systems. Therefore, we need to develop some kind of law that deals with the use of autonomous weapons.
Okay, so Milena, if as Craig notes, we can't rely on the CCW to regulate, how are we regulating the use of autonomous weapons? What laws apply, and are they sufficient? And can we all go home early?
No, we can't go home early. Too many questions still remain. So I would just add to what Craig was saying, in addition to the CCW and this group of governmental experts that have been discussing how to define autonomous weapons, how to develop a regulatory framework, there was also a specific call from the UN Secretary General, who has called for a legally binding instrument to prohibit lethal autonomous weapon systems that operate without human control or oversight. And he also recommended that all the other types of autonomous weapon systems be regulated. So a specific call to say lethal autonomous weapons without human control should be banned. And then these other categories of perhaps non-lethal weapons or semi-autonomous weapons need to be regulated. And then also in the context of the European Union, the European Parliament has also adopted a resolution urging the EU and its member states to negotiate a legally binding instrument which would prohibit lethal autonomous weapons and would stress, quote, the fundamental importance of preventing the development and production of any lethal autonomous weapon systems lacking human control in critical functions such as target selection and engagement, end of quote. So we do have these very specific calls for action. Now, we still don't have a multilateral treaty, and I'm very skeptical as to whether we will have one anytime in the near future. Now, there are the Geneva Conventions, which to the extent that these weapons are used in armed conflict do apply. So there's Article 36, which we've mentioned several times today, which requires states to review the legality of new weapons, including those with automated or autonomous features, but query as to how this can actually be done. This sort of presupposes that the Geneva Convention somehow have a body of experts available to review any new weapons that come about. There's also Common Article 1, which requires states to respect and ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions in all circumstances, including a positive obligation for third countries to prevent violations of the Geneva Conventions. So this all obviously applies. And then the other fundamental point is to say that national laws of various countries do apply. And then when you look at different jurisdictions across the world, you'll see that different states have attempted to adopt definitions of autonomous weapon systems, and some states have attempted at least to develop some regulatory frameworks. The problem with this is that it's not a unified approach. What that means is that different states potentially can have very different definitions. You know, some are more aligned with the ICRC, but some are not. And different countries have different approaches in terms of what kind of a regulatory approach is needed, if any at all. And so I think we're left with a fragmented approach to any potential regulation of autonomous weapon systems.
So, Lori, let's dive into Milena's observations a little bit more. And in your view, is existing treaty law and customary law, something we talked about yesterday, sufficient to regulate these questions and these challenges? And if not, how do we improve it or innovate it or modify it or amend it? I'm not sure what we settled on.
Well, we've already heard how easy it is to get new law, so we can start there. But so one like small nuance point that I want to add into the conversation, I think we sometimes think about autonomous weapons as if they also decide to join the conflict autonomously, which is not the case, right? I sometimes joke about autonomous Bob, who just opens his hangar and flies off to select and engage targets. A commander would deploy this type of weapon or weapon system in a particular situation for a particular reason, for a particular purpose. It's not as if the president says, okay, we're going to go to war, use my constitutional power and thought about the use of bellum, and then the secretary, passes orders to the COCOM commanders, and they're like, all right, we're going to send in the 81st Airborne and this and that, and then we're going to also send in the Autonomous Weapons Brigade. Like, it doesn't, that's not, at least now, for hopefully a long time, but so just that little bit of nuance. In terms of your question, I think we can think about it at a macro level and then more specifically. At the macro level, we have treaties that regulate the conduct of hostilities and protect persons during armed conflict. None of these treaties say, except if you're using a weapon that is using artificial intelligence. Like, so there's no exception that keeps autonomous weapons out, and the core principles and rules apply. The key questions are how, right? And if the way the law is framed and the way we understand that either leaves questions that need answers. So when we think about weapons, our first question is it a lawful weapon? Here we're thinking about, is it calculated to cause unnecessary suffering? And is it an indiscriminate weapon? I don't think we see concerns with either of these with regard to autonomous weapons, unless you decided to deploy an autonomous weapon that its munition was, poison gas or chemical weapons or something. Obviously, then it would be unlawful. We hear a lot of debate about the prohibition of indiscriminate weapons. What that is prohibiting is weapons that cannot be directed at a specific military objective or whose effects cannot be limited. I don't think that also is the case with autonomous weapons. In addition, this question it depends on where you're using the weapon. So if you're using the weapon where there are no civilians at all, then we're not having a question about discrimination. So it comes down to lawful use. And let me just share some sort of thoughts from the discourse. Distinction seems to be one, obviously critically important, but where the AI capabilities, the machine learning, the capabilities of an autonomous weapon could actually be beneficial. That it could comply with distinction and enhance our abilities there. Doesn't mean it would, but it seems that it could. Precautions. Could such a system engage in the necessary precautions? Possibly. And we have to add in that the choice of means or methods of warfare is a precaution. So we want to think about whether having an autonomous weapon is something you should have if that's the only way to attack something lawfully. Would that be fulfilling your obligations? Proportionality, of course, is the kicker. Assessing and quantifying incidental harm seems like something that a machine could do, and perhaps would be well suited to. It's data, it's analyzing, it's math, so to speak, right? Not to make it sound impersonal. But what about military advantage? I think this is where we see the significant challenge. How do these types of systems take into account the complexity and the fluidity of the contemporary battle space, all the different things that are going on, and factor that all in? What kind of connectivity do you need between and among these systems and the humans that are taking part in other aspects of the battle space? I will leave for another part of the conversation the debates about accountability, but we certainly don't want to leave out questions of accountability. So we can come back to other questions.
Yeah, we'll save that towards the end, or hopefully in a Q&A, someone will ask, hint, hint, how far does accountability go in the stream, and does it go all the way back to Silicon Valley? Romina, we're now at the $1 million question. Geneva Conventions. How do they apply? How do you apply, you and your friends? And why did Michael put you at the back kiddie table, by the way? We should be having that conversation separately. So how is it that you apply the Geneva Conventions to these lethal autonomous weapons? And turning to John Bellinger's lunchtime question, are there any gaps? And if so, how do we fill those gaps?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And maybe before answering that, I also wanted to add to the different initiatives that are being taken by states in the Americas, because I'm covering here the Americas. There are two very interesting initiatives. One is the Belém Communiqué that gather all the countries in the Americas plus some observer states. Is of course a declaration, but they in that declaration they say that IHL international law is applicable and it should be considered. And even a stronger declaration was done, I think, at the end of last year by the CARICOM states, in which they say that IHL applies and that there is a need of a binding document banning these autonomous weapon systems that do not have control. So I do think that from different parts in different countries, as it was the previous speaker was mentioning before, there are some agreements between small regions or sub-regions that are going into that direction of drafting and trying to negotiate a binding treaty. So regarding the Geneva Conventions, of course, as ICRC, we do consider that the Geneva Conventions and the principles that are there, but also the additional protocols and in customary IHL applies to the autonomous weapon systems. However, as I just said, and this is something that I think the different panels have discussed, is not always that the ICRC says that we have a full coverage with the Geneva Conventions. We do say in other situations, for example, in cyber that my colleague mentioned before, that we do consider that the rules are there and we need interpretation. But here on autonomous weapon systems, we do consider that there is a need, there is a gap, there is a need to go further and to create these type of rules, prohibiting certain weapons and restricting some others. Regarding the ones that are going to be, so the main concern, and before there was this idea of course, there is a commander that launch these autonomous weapon systems, and it is the case, but normally the determination made at that moment with the commander launch that autonomous weapon systems can change. And these circumstances and changing circumstances can make a target or the software that has designed that was designed to attack a specific target not be applicable in that moment anymore. And this risk of the lack of predictability of how they are going to act is increased if we are having autonomous weapons systems that can stay outside in the battlefield for longer time, or they can cover different types of areas, not only areas that do not have civilians, or they can engage on a big amount of strikes in a period of time. So this is something that we see and that we are concerned specifically for the effects that it could have on civilians, but also on combatant horse of combat. And we do consider that some of these autonomous weapon systems would be against the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, especially because those where we cannot really understand the effects that they will have. We cannot predict them. We cannot explain them. You know, I just mentioned the black box effect. If we cannot know how the weapon is going to take the different aspects of an environment and make a decision, then we consider that that weapon would be in its design indiscriminate, so against IHL. And then the other main element that I want to mention is also with the principle of distinction, because if we have weapons that target or that are used or that are designed to target persons, we do have a risk on this principle of distinction, because in the battlefield, we do not necessarily know, there are different circumstances on how people take place, like civilians take place in hostilities, which just was mentioned that not everybody is in agreement with that. So there are different ways on that element. And also there are different ways on how civilians or combatants surrender or react to being wounded. So that cannot be codified or put in a software or standardized in all people. And the second element as well is that this assumption of targetability of a person on whether it's going to be a military objective or if the person is a combatant or not can change very quickly. And for that reason, we do need to have humans involved in this type of decisions. Otherwise, we do see that there is a big problem of the application of the principle of distinction, specifically in this type of weapons that are designed to target human beings.
I'm going to want to come back to that in a little bit in the Q&A, and whether these autonomous weapons can be their own JAG council. Sorry, Mike, I know you're trying to push your students into the JAG, but can you program ChatGPT and put it into the autonomous weapon, and can it give advice on proportionality and distinction in real time in the air? Before we get to that, though, that's just to preview a Q&A question that I'm sure someone will ask from the audience. Lori, we have arms control on one hand, we have Geneva Conventions on the other hand. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, or vanilla ice cream versus milk almond fudge? Which one do you go with?
Or as I like to say, half of one, 6 dozen of the other.
That works too.
I think that, well, first of all, we don't have to choose, right? We should use all the law that we have available. We don't need to only pick the very best law and then not worry about other things. We should have a sturdy scaffolding, or whatever analogy you like. I think, let me throw out a couple of things. First of all, I think we have to really wrestle with a couple of overarching themes in thinking about the application of law, whether it's treaty law or customary law. And that is that we have centuries, millennia, et cetera, of experience in teaching and training human beings to do things, and at least having a sense of what goes on in a human brain, or being able to intuit or empathize or rationalize what happens in a human brain when a decision is made. Those of you who have kids, we know sometimes it's no way to figure that one out and what's happening in those brains, but we at least, it's something we can relate to. We don't know how to relate to a machine processing data and making a decision. That doesn't mean that it's either right or wrong for a machine A to do it, or when a machine does it. It just means we don't know how to put ourselves in the shoes of the machine if it wears shoes. So we have to then, another piece is that the law of war rests fundamentally on reasonableness. That is the touchstone of the law of war. When we think about proportionality, it's a reasonableness construct. When we think about assessing whether a person is a legitimate target, right? To go back to some of the conversation from this morning, that is based on a reasonableness. It is not, I am 100% right or 100% wrong, and it's strict liability after the fact. How do we understand reasonableness when we're talking about machines, even machines that learn, which again is a sort of a strange concept. I know that if I use a calculator, I think I'm confident it should be right every single time. My toaster should toast when I ask it to toast and not do something else just because it thinks that's a better choice. So how do we understand a machine and reasonableness? We haven't talked about bias in terms of the data. So how do you understand, to me, this is almost maybe a bigger challenge than the programming of the law. If the machine has learned from data that is from the conflicts we've had for the past 20 plus years, that is not the same scenario as the conflicts we might have. And so how do we understand that? I think that's a big challenge. And then I just wonder if I could pick up a couple of some of the ethical points that have come up. Well, I guess one thing is, and I'm going to quote a colleague of ours who said, let's not forget that human soldiers are autonomous weapons, right? We train them and we send them out to do something. And we're not standing there next to them immediately saying, now pull the trigger, now do this, now do that. So we have been essentially deploying autonomous actors with training. But again, we understand somewhat the human, or we also have human brains. And then I also want to throw out, because I think the conversation about self-driving cars, and Craig, you said we feel worse when the accident happens because of that. And Romina, you mentioned there's an ethical question about whether it's right for a machine to take a life. And those are really hard questions, but I want to throw into the mix, why do we think it's automatically right that a human should be the one who bears the moral decision to take a life? So if we think about this not only for the perspective of the life being taken, but the young man or woman that we've sent off to protect our nation and to use deadly force on our behalf, which is not an easy task. If you've seen any of the studies that show, what enormous percentage of frontline soldiers never fire their weapon because it's exceedingly difficult to actually teach aggression, to teach the use of deadly force. Why do we automatically assume that we want to place that burden on humans? And I don't know the answer to this, but I think we should consider, at least inject into the conversation that maybe, that's not necessarily right. Like, we're just assuming that we here, but like the general discourse is assuming this is something humans should bear. I don't know, if it's my kid who has to do that, maybe I want to relieve them of some of that moral hazard. So I just throw that into the mix as well.
Perfect timing. That leads right into Greg's next question of, can we really expect these autonomous weapons systems to comply with the core principles of the Geneva Conventions, proportionality, distinction, precaution, either in what we ask them to do or what they decide to do on their own?
That's the $1 million question. But and some, I think some of that has been answered in part in some of the other answers. But I'll dive into it. But before I start, I just wanted to address Laurie's last point, because I think I think it's a really interesting point. I think there's a lot to it. But I think the corollary to that is that if we're relieving humans of the moral magnitude of killing, then we're making it a lot easier to kill, right? And so that is the flip side of that equation that has to be thought through. And I would caution, like when we're having this conversation, we keep getting into these ethical and intuitive, I don't want to call them digressions. I think they're really important questions, but they're somewhat distinct from the law. So let me go back to the law and answer your question, Paul, with two caveats. The first is that there's been a huge, very robust debate over the question of whether or not autonomous weapons can comply with the core principles of IHL. That is the principles of distinction. I mean, there are more than these three, but the three that really exercise people in this debate are the principles of distinction, the principle of precautions in attack, and the principle of proportionality. And so there's been a very robust debate with people, very respected colleagues on both ends of those, arguing that actually autonomous weapons could be more compliant, that they're actually going to be better than human beings. Human beings, by the way, are not remotely devoid of bias and foibles and so forth, a la Daniel Kahneman and Tversky. And that therefore autonomous weapon systems might be far better. And those on the other side of the equation who say that regardless of those biases and so forth, it's essential that humans be in the loop. Human judgment has to be at the core of decision-making in IHL. But that debate really began around the 2010s, 2012, and straight through to 2020. And the one caveat I would note is that in the last 2 years, AI has advanced so much in such a short period of time that some of that debate already starts to look dated in terms of the assumptions it was making about the capability and capacity of machine learning and AI. So that's one. And I note that my time is rapidly disappearing. So let me dive into the principle of proportionality as an example. I think, as Laurie foreshadowed, it's perhaps the principle that has the most difficulty around it, and it's one that is at the very center of the debate. And for the students, you will recall that Articles 51 and 57 of AP1 requires commanders to refrain from launching an attack, which may be, in the language I think here is quite important, which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which may be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Now, this principle is notoriously difficult to operationalize, even for humans, right? Given that it requires the balancing of incommensurate norms, among other things. And we've seen how differing interpretations have fueled huge debates. 1 minute. He let me borrow some time from later.
You can have some of my conclusions.
I'll try to make this very quick. But we've seen how differing interpretations of the principle of proportionality has given rise to all kinds of debates over what's going on in Gaza. That's just the latest example. But if we drill into the principle and separate out each of the elements and assess what they mean and stop to consider what it means to try to, first of all, program and operationalize these in an autonomous weapon system with AI capacity, and then think about how the AI would then operationalize the principle in the course of conducting an attack, I think you start to see the difficulties and the concerns, right? So just to, if you bear with me for a second and just walk through an analysis of some of the elements of the principle, right? And think about what the decision maker needs to assess in terms of the incidental harm that would be caused, not only directly, but also the foreseeable reverberating harms, the second and third order consequences that would be foreseeably caused by the strike. And not only to assess whether these harms were foreseeable, but to assess the likelihood of those harms for purposes of calculating the weight that has to be attributed to the harm if it were to materialize for the purposes of the calculation proportionality. And also, of course, right, when you're determining whether the harm would be caused to civilians, this requires you to know, well, who is a civilian, right? Which of the people harmed were civilians? or whether they were combatants, or whether they were civilians who were taking direct part in hostilities at the time that they were harmed, or whether they were perhaps members of an organized armed group who were in a continuous combat function, to go back to the debates earlier today, or whether the harm was to a civilian object, or whether actually it was being used partially for military reasons, and therefore it was, at the time of the attack, a military objective. And this is the incidental harm, which Laurie indicated was actually kind of easy for AI to figure out, which I would suggest it's actually not, right? But then you get to the other side of the equation, which is to determine what was the direct and concrete military advantage to be gained in the strike, right? And the strike here is the strike as a whole, which means that this particular strike may be part of a series of strikes, all of which is the military advantage that has to be considered, right? Which the AI has to calculate, and has, whether it has access to that information at the time of the strike, given that there's going to be jamming and the poisoning of data and so forth in the environment. And so, in the interest of time, I'll sort of cut it there. But if you think through the difficulty of assessing all of these elements for the purposes of attributing weight to each side of the equation to determine whether the harm would be excessive, right? It becomes really difficult to see how an AI is going to do that. And as Romina said, more importantly, it's difficult to see how it would do that in a predictable way that could be understood after the fact and assessed after the fact for purposes of attribution and accountability.
Great. Thanks, Greg. We'll turn to our last question now from Elena before we open it up to Q&A. Domestic law. Elena, what's happening on the domestic scene? Is it adequate? And does it run counter to the purposes of getting a global consensus on this issue?
Thanks for that question, Paul. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's fair to say that most of these efforts to actually define autonomous weapon systems and to develop a regulatory framework have been taking place at the national level. So Laurie already mentioned, for example, in the US, there's a Department of Defense policy on autonomy in weapon systems, which defines lethal autonomous weapon systems as, quote, weapon systems that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. And then the same directive then essentially has categories, in particular when it comes to the concept of autonomy, and it talks about 3 different categories of weapons where human is in the loop, and these would really be what's known as semi-autonomous weapons, where human is on the loop, weapons which have where essentially the weapon is making decisions, but the operator, the human operator, has the ability to monitor or halt a weapon's target engagement, and then weapons where the human is completely out of the loop. And there are other states that have similar approaches. Many states do not have laws clearly defining autonomous weapon systems. So states like China, Germany, Belgium, Brazil, Finland, Italy, Portugal, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, these are states that there have been efforts to define autonomous weapon systems, but those efforts haven't come to a sort of full fruition. There are states which have developed definitions of autonomous weapon systems which are in line with the ICRC approach, and to the extent that you dislike fragmentation, you could say, okay, that's a good thing because at least there's some sort of uniformity because states are aligning with the ICRC. But I think it's fair to say that most states are not in this category of states fully aligned with the ICRC. Sticking points obviously include both the definition of autonomous weapon systems, but also limitations. How do you actually develop a regulatory framework that's coherent and that's in line with international law? And so all of this to say that there are various efforts at the national level. I won't bore you with the details of various, national level legislations. And I would say that to a large extent, these efforts are complementary to efforts to actually develop a multilateral treaty. And oftentimes when it comes to the development of treaty law, we see the development of national laws in parallel. So I think, it's not just about autonomous weapons. When you look at all other areas of international law, if not all, then most other areas of international law, we oftentimes see efforts in parallel at the national level and at the international level. But to emphasize what I said earlier, I'm really skeptical as to the possibility of developing a unified, international level approach. And I think that we are going to be stuck, for better or for worse, with these national level attempts at defining autonomous weapon systems and then developing appropriate regulatory frameworks.
Thanks, Milena. Let's go ahead now and throw it open to questions. I would like to encourage our young to stand up and use the microphone right there. Yep. Rock, paper, scissors. And I'd like to encourage our young professionals who I know have read all of the, looking at you guys, who've read all of these articles and probably have some questions that inquiring minds want to know. Go ahead and kick it off.
Well, thank you to the panel for quite a scintillating conversation. I have two questions. The first is a quick one. About specifically non-lethal autonomous weapons. A recent example are the ones deployed in Hebron and in Bethlehem, which are not meant to kill anybody or to target militants. They're more meant towards protesters to shoot tear gas and rubber bullets. So should there be a regulatory framework for those types of weapons? And they're done without human intervention, obviously. But the question I care more about is in the current war in Gaza, we've witnessed, and this is, I guess, related. It's not so much the use of autonomous weaponry, but the use of AI in warfare. And this has been, I'm sure some of the panelists have read the work of Yuval Abraham on 972 magazine, and it's the use of artificial intelligence integrating some concepts from humanitarian law, definitely distinction, definitely proportionality in code, in actual code, to give everybody in Gaza a number between 0 and 100 about like how likely they are to be a militant, and to also calculate proportionality. But we have no idea the actual code. Like, is it for a high-level commander, can you kill 3 or can you kill 1,000? And do we need more of hardline regulations? Because when we get to code, the reasonable standard has always been what a reasonable commander would do, has always been kind of wishy-washy. But now it needs to be put into code, actual numbers. Should there be regulation of the code? And also the regulation of the degree of human interaction. What comes from reading those large number of testimonies that Yuval Abraham collects is that there is a sort of reliance when you get from the machine information that these are legitimate targets. The human automatically relies on that as fact, and it becomes a rubber stamp, which could be problematic. So those are my two primary questions.
We don't trust autonomous cars, but we trust autonomous weapons. All right, I need to volunteer for the first question, Lori, and who's going to volunteer for the second question? Knock yourself out. Go second first.
Tackle either one.
I'll go first.
All right, Elena,
Go. Okay, I'll go.
you two take these questions.
So there's existing law about the type of riot control things you're talking about. I'll leave that to Milena. I think we first of all want to be discerning in when we read accounts of what's happening in different conflicts, and understanding that not everything we read is the entire story of what is going on. And I think that my understanding of the systems that you're referring to is quite different from what you've described. And I think there's been a variety of things. There's information provided by the IDF about what these systems are and how they use them. And I think that what you're referring to is something called Lavender and something called Gospel. And what I understand these systems to do is to be a database that takes intelligence information from a variety of sources, information that is collected through whether it's SIGINT, HUMINT, GeoINT, all the various sources, and it processes and analyzes that information in a quantity and a pace that is what we have AI for. And then it produces sort of nuggets of information for human analysts to then assess. So it takes an enormous amount of information that a human being would require years to pick through and process, and it can do that obviously much faster, but then it spits out nuggets like that. Look at those things, look at these things, look at those things, look at those people. That then is used by human analysts to go through the ordinary process of assessing targets, selecting targets, and needs to go through multiple levels of human superiors. And you can read again this in various open sources. I'm not describing anything that's not open source. And so I think that we're not talking about an autonomous system of selecting targets. We're talking about a database that helps human beings process information and injects into their system. So I don't think that we're in the autonomous weapons space at all in thinking about that. We are in a space of talking about artificial intelligence and how are humans using it as part of a human process. But I think we want to be very careful not to sensationalize things. And I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying in the discourse this happens because it is it is a serious conversation about whether an autonomous selection and engagement process, like I guess the Libya, there've been a couple of examples. Obviously, it's being developed. We've already identified a lot of the interesting challenges, but I think it is important to differentiate the various different ways that AI is being used. And as I understand it, there is no development of a kill list by AI of collateral damage values like you're a 2, you're a 9, right? I think is what you were sort of describing. That's not what these systems do. They're databases. They don't act, right? They spit stuff out for humans to deal with.
Let's Milena, and then Craig wants to jump in as well.
Sure, I'll be real brief. And I think just to add to what you were saying, I think where we get uncomfortable is the fact that, there's this notion that these machines are making decisions in a way where a human would be able to make a better decision. To translate this to like layperson language, one hypothetical that's come up that really speaks to me is the one of like identical twins and facial recognition, right? I'm a twin. I'm an identical twin. I have identical twin daughters. Well, most humans can't tell them apart, right? So this notion that somehow the machine is going to make the error when in all likelihood a human would have been more.
Are you your sister?
I'm my sister.
Today?
Yes, exactly. A human wouldn't have necessarily made the same decision. So I think we have to be careful there. On the second question, and I'll be really brief on this distinction of lethal autonomous weapon systems and non-lethal autonomous weapon systems. The short answer is yes. There have been efforts at the national level to separate the two. So within the context of this group of governmental experts that Greg mentioned at the CCW, for example, Belgium had a very specific proposal to essentially develop different sets of rules to say like no to lethal autonomous weapon systems, especially if a human isn't sufficiently involved, but to separate other non-lethal autonomous weapon systems and say those should be, those are sort of okay. We still need regulation, but those are okay. And at one point, France and Germany argued for a similar type of a two-tiered approach. It's fair to say, as Craig mentioned, that to a large extent, there has been tremendous disagreement, and I don't think that we have a consensus on that. But the short answer is yes, there have been developments, there have been efforts to separate the two.
Craig, jump on in.
Yeah, so I guess I share a bit more of your concern about both Lavender in particular, right? So the two AI systems that have been reported on in Israel. And to be fair, 725 magazine has one account. The IDF has come back with a lot of denials and disputes much of what was reported. So it has to all be placed into a lot of context. But if we take the Lavender account on its face, right, the Lavender system is being used to identify individuals. And I think there's two aspects of what you're getting at that I think are troubling, right? There's the one is that the AI is purporting to, as Lori says, crunch a great deal of data and spit out the probability that an individual is associated with, in this case, Hamas, right? But just let's separate it from Israel. Let's just take this idea, right, of it, which kind of is reminiscent of Black Mirror, a system that is identifying individuals as being targetable, basically, right? And the aspect that the first part, the first element that's troubling for you, I think I share your concern, is that it's not transparent, right? You can't get inside the AI to ask, well, what was the basis of your identification? Like, how do we know, with what confidence should we accept this identification? And then the second element is something called automation bias, which you referred to, right? And this automation bias is this over-reliance by humans on the information that they receive from AI systems, right? So as Lori put it, individuals are supposed to be taking this information and then doing further due diligence and making final decisions. And the final decision is being made by a human, and we should take some comfort in that, except automation bias often means that humans are just rubber stamping the decision made by the AI, right? And then we see this sort of thing, in a much more mundane context where you get a credit score, it has an impact on your life, but nobody can tell you exactly how that credit score was arrived at, right? It's just spat out by an AI. And that's and Laurie's quite right, this is not really in the context of autonomous weapons, but it's similar types of AI systems that are going to be potentially feeding into autonomous weapons, making decisions about targeting.
Great, thanks. We have about 8 minutes for more questions. Jen, you want to jump in, and then go ahead. And we'll take both. Sir, go to that microphone. Jen, ask your question, because I know these answers can be long, and then we'll have this question over here.
Yeah, Paul, I think you invited a question on accountability.
Yes.
So drawing from international criminal law, I think we need substantial assistance. So in the AI context, is it the person who decides to deploy the AI? Is it who's the person in the loop? And would it ever go back to those in Silicon Valley who are creating the technology? Are they playing a substantial role? And let's say it is used to commit, let's say a crime results down at the end. So who along the way is our potential list of perpetrators we might want to look at?
Thanks, Jen. Your question, and if there are any other questions, we'll ask them and take them all together.
Mine is a little bit related to the accountability question, but it's more as a former technologist, trying to understand the role that accuracy and effectiveness testing plays in the green lighting, right, of these kinds of tools, because you can't build a chatbot for the government without the government establishing some sort of user acceptance testing, but warfighting in the context of using artificial intelligence has a different, time horizon. It has, different thresholds, and this is groundbreaking stuff. So what role does that play in us being able to use that to potentially take people's lives? So.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the audience or from our young professionals on Law Review? Okay, we have 5 minutes for panelists. If we could give them each a minute, because you guys are so good. Start them off with the 1 minute mark. And each of you take in and answer those questions, share some concluding remarks in 60 seconds or less. Romina, do you want to start, Romina?
Okay. Yes, regarding accountability, of course, this is one of the discussions that have been, it's one of the challenges that we see now in the discussions on autonomous weapon systems. As I mentioned before, the ones that have to comply with IHL are persons, they are not the machines. And there we have a discussion on whether it is those that are reviewing, for example, in a specific type of weapon that is going to be used by the military, are they responsible? Is the commander in particular that is launching that attack with autonomous weapons, considering the circumstances for that specific attack, the one that is responsible? Or at the end is, if we're having a semi-autonomous weapons, that there is a final decision maker allowing for that strike to happen, is that the person responsible? And then we have an extra layer of command responsibility as well, if we're talking about international criminal law, and also in some cases in national law as well. So all of these questions that we normally face with other types of weapons, yes, we also have it here, and there are those three main actors that might be involved in this type of responsibility. Thank you.
Milena, do you want to jump in? And then Craig, and then Lori, and Mike's going to play the Game of Thrones theme song if I don't end on time.
Sure. So on accountability, and I think that is the million-dollar question here. So first of all, when it comes to developers, I do think it's important to emphasize that international humanitarian law only applies during armed conflict, and sometimes you have situations where weapons are developed before the start of armed conflict, so IHL really doesn't apply to those developers. I think it's also important to emphasize that sometimes developers are part of a military and can face, justice through the military system at the national level, but sometimes those developers are going to be civilians, and so they're going to have to be prosecuted separately in the civilian system, which is not obviously impossible, but which poses additional challenges. And then I would also say that when it comes to then criminal responsibility for the operator or the commander, I think the problem there is going to be the mens rea. Most crimes, and especially ICL crimes, require some mens rea, intent, knowledge, recklessness. And if somebody is acting and relying on good faith, sort of advice of AI, they have information, they said, well, this machine told me X, this was a target. It later turns out that that wasn't the case. You could say, well, that person really didn't have the requisite mens rea. And so we might be in a vacuum when it comes to the possibility of attributing criminal responsibility to anybody, which I think is one of the most problematic aspects of using autonomous weapon systems.
Thanks, Milena. Craig, and then Lori.
So, Melena actually just said much of what I was going to say. So I totally agree with her. But I do think that, the accountability problem and the way in which responsibility is diffuse, and, when the commander who has launched or, used the autonomous weapon system is now being held accountable. We have problems with command responsibility, as Melena pointed out. The standard is, they knew or ought to have known, but with the AI, the problem exactly is we don't know what the black box is doing. There's a lack of transparency, which Romina has been getting at. And this really gets to, and we didn't really finally get in our discussion to, how should the Geneva Conventions be amended or adjusted or added to or supplemented? And I think one answer to that question gets at this problem, which is that, you really should have provisions that prohibit the use of autonomous weapon systems in particular circumstances or environments. So, for instance, in urban theaters or in counterinsurgency operations where you're in a non-international armed conflict where there are a lot of civilian objects, and only permit autonomous weapon systems in circumstances where you're not likely going to be implicating principles of proportionality and so forth with civilians. And then you get a bit away from the likely problems of accountability.
Lori, last word.
Okay,
Be
just
brilliant.
the way I like it. So one quick thing on accountability, but then I'm going to turn to your question. I think we don't want to forget, it is the commander knows, should have known. Commanders, they're not going out there just sort of wondering what's going on. They own their space. They own everything that they are doing, everything they are deploying. They need to know. One of the questions actually is, how much does a commander need to know before he or she feels comfortable? So I'll leave that. But let me come to your question, because I think it's really points out a great thing, which is that the law of war has tolerance for disparate judgments, right? We might all be in a zone of reasonableness and not reach the exact same thing, but still think we're all acting reasonably. We have trouble understanding that for machines. And your point about sort of efficacy testing and accuracy testing, we talk about a confidence rating, right? Like it's a 95% or it's a 98%, and you've got to reach that you guys are nodding, that's good, because you know more about this than I do. So let me quickly point out a couple of certainty issues that I see in the way we talk about and think about autonomous weapons. So there's the certainty of technology, right? How does it actually work? We're all talking, we have no idea. We literally have no clue, right? We're guessing. What can I use it for? How durable is it? Will it break? What would cause it to break? Is it reliable? Will it do the same thing every time? What might make it do something wrong? How would how would autonomous Bob interact with autonomous Ivan if we're fighting the Russians? What is the likelihood and reaction to jamming, spoofing, errors, infiltration, things like that? So that's the certainty of technology. What about the certainty of the legal norms and the application of those in an autonomous weapon? I don't know that we certainly don't all in this room have exactly the same way of interpreting some of the core principles as we play them out. So what's getting programmed in? And then last thing, the certainty of the analyses and decisions of this machine. How does it make decisions? Would it make the same decision every time? What level of certainty would it apply to identifying a target? We apply reasonableness. Does a machine understand reasonableness, or are we talking about, well, reasonableness is a 79% accuracy rating? I don't know. Same thing with respect to civilian harm, military advantage. How does it analyze sort of variables? So we understand how a commander might do that. We have to sort of get comfortable with what does it mean when a machine does things, how certain do we need to be?
Please join me in thanking our Thomas Jefferson panel.